No. At least, not in my opinion. My favorite From Software game is Sekiro. But Sekiro's combat, movement, story, and overall feel are pretty drastically different from the rest of From Software's post-Demon Souls lineup. My favorite Souls game is Dark Souls 3. And while my experience with Dark Souls 1 and 2 is limited, and with Demon Souls non-existent, I can pretty confidently put Elden Ring at a very close number 2 in my favorites list. Spoilers for Elden Ring ahead. The first time I booted up Elden Ring was an incredible experience. After having gone through the game's tutorial, I was set loose on a vast land with limitless possibilities ahead of me. I decided to disregard the game's direction and set off to find my own adventure. In doing so, I found my way down to a swamp from some cliffs nearby. And then I saw it. A dragon. A majestic beast in the open world. I knew I had little to lose, so I charged in, katana in hand, and I was promptly killed, as the dragon was obviously way stronger than me. After dying to the dragon, I had the biggest grin on my face. I immediately knew this game was going to be a great time. Nothing quite ruins a game like level scaling. If every enemy is scaled to your level, the entire world becomes bland and pointless. The fact that Elden Ring put such a strong enemy right at the very beginning of the game was a good sign. Now, as much as a magical moment as that was for me, I actually lied about one little thing. And that was that it wasn't actually my first time trying to play the game. I play on PC, and if there's one thing big developers can never get right, it's PC ports. They come out at the same time as console releases, oftentimes looking better, sporting better load times and frame rates, depending on hardware of course, but they're just as often unfinished, unpolished, unoptimized pieces of shit. Now, I don't have the best PC in the world, and seeing as right now it's impossible to get a GPU at anything less than double MSRP, I'm not in much of a position to upgrade either. But my computer's not bad, and can typically handle whatever I throw at it. But as I'm watching the opening cutscene to Elden Ring, something strange happens. The game freezes. I think that's annoying, but whatever, and continue on. Before I can get to the first enemy, it freezes again. And these aren't short 1 to 5 second freezes. These are 30 seconds to a minute long. Eventually, I end up reinstalling everything on my computer, including Windows, and that fixes the issue. Well, mostly. I've rambled about my technical difficulties long enough, but I think it's important to bring up, because it really soured my initial impression of the game, and made me wait a week to play a game that I bought on launch. But none of that is really important in the grand scheme of things. There's only one thing that matters in the end. Is the game fun? Yes, it's a blast. From Software has once again cemented themselves as the king of the very subgenre they created. Everything in this vast world feels meticulously constructed. I'm sure a ridiculous amount of time went into enemy placement alone. The level design though, that's what's always been the most impressive part about the Souls games to me. They managed to make a relatively small map size feel much bigger than it is by teasing the player with items just out of reach, branching paths, fake walls, and hard to spot areas. Elden Ring takes these masterfully crafted areas and makes them focal points of a larger open world. While a game's world matters a lot, if the places in that world aren't interesting and engaging, then what's the point of it? For most players, the first place that encapsulates everything that is From Software level design is Stormveil Castle, and it's an amazing introduction. Before you even get to the castle gates, you have to make your way through soldiers, giants, and ballistas. And once you get past all that, you encounter the first real boss of the game, Margit, the Fell Omen. This guy is going to be a quit moment for a lot of new players. As of writing the script, only about 75% of players on Steam have beaten him. And honestly, that's a lot more than I was expecting. Margit can be brutal. You get very few chances to heal as he doesn't let up on his attacks, and he hits you from range. But the hardest part of Margit, and the hardest part of Souls combat in general, are the wind-ups. It was a staple of the games that came before Elden Ring, but it's even more pronounced in this one. Margit will hold his cane over his head for several seconds before swinging, prompting you to panic roll and get nailed by his attacks. The bosses will defy gravity, holding in the air for what feels like an eternity, before crashing back down to earth and taking your health with it. Margit must have taken me 15 tries to take down, but when I did, nothing felt better. I literally got up and physically popped off before walking around to cool down. This is why FromSoft makes all its games hard. The reward you get is well worth the struggle. So, level design. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. After besting Margit in honorable one-on-one combat, you get to enter Stormveil Castle. And it has it all. Branching paths, difficult enemies, insane moments, secret walkways. These stupid fucking birds that can just go straight to hell. Stormveil Castle is peak From Software. And once you've traversed the whole castle and beaten the second boss, you're greeted with a gorgeous view and a reminder that the game is just beginning. Or you can just skip all of that and go around. That's where the game's open world comes into play. Being obviously inspired by Breath of the Wild, the game's map is sparse with information. They actually added NPC locations to the map post-launch because it was a bit too cryptic. Elden Ring really boasts that go anywhere, anytime mindset. Of course, it will gently nudge the player in the right direction with enemies that will brutally murder you in one hit, as well as push the player more directly with paths of grace that literally point you in the right direction. Of course, you're free to ignore all of that and find your own adventure. Before even beating Margit, I wanted to know if I could make my way out to one of the huge, but not quite as big as the really big one, trees that dotted the landscape. And yes, I got to the base of the tree and ended up going down a nearby elevator to find the ruins of an underground civilization filled with creepy husk zombies and spectral Vikings, all culminating in a boss fight against a mystic elk. I even had a friend that skipped Stormveil Castle entirely without ever seeing Margit, and another friend who skipped past a part of the game I thought was totally impassable without the correct item by going underground. Point is that as good as the level design for the more linear section is, the open world is just as good. At least most of the time. Elden Ring suffers from the same problem most open world games do, that being repetitiveness. While it's a lot better than your typical Ubisoft slop, it's still bogged down by a lot of the smaller dungeons feeling very samey. Even though typically the dungeons are thematically pretty different, the fact that they all have the same homogeneous design and a lot of recurring enemies, as well as the same general completion requirements, makes them feel repetitive. Not that that's a big issue when the rest of the open world content is so good. From castles to raid to quests to do, there's a lot to distract you in the lands between. Speaking of quests, it turns out I'm a fucking idiot. In previous Souls games, there were these things called covenants. You could only join one at a time, and it was only really useful for PvP or to get certain items. Now, in Elden Ring, there are no covenants, but I assumed that there were. So when quest skimmers asked me to join them, I declined, thinking I would be joining a covenant, and therefore stopping me from doing several quest lines until much further into the game. This isn't a knock on the game, it's just me being a total fucking dumbass. And while we're on the topic of me being a dumbass, let's talk combat. If you've played any of the previous Souls games, there's not much new here. You've got your dodge roll, which is separated into 3 tiers of fast, medium, and heavy. There's light and heavy attacks, as well as shields. But the gameplay differs in one important way. Weapon arts have been substantially buffed. In previous Souls games, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't even know they were in the game. But in Elden Ring, weapon arts do serious damage. And they even affect stat scaling. Not to mention that outside of certain boss weapons, you can change the weapon arts on your equipment. Gone are the days of two-handing weapons for weapon arts. Now it doesn't matter if you're two-handing, one-handing, dual-wielding, using a bow, As long as the weapon has one, you can use its weapon art. They also changed how backstabbing works, and parrying was replaced, but that didn't affect my playthrough that much. And I'm not sure if this is true, but it feels like you barely have to upgrade your stamina compared to previous games. A lot of weapons also now scale with stats outside of strength and dex. My final build had me have 40 arcane and 50 dex, because I used a weapon that scaled with both. This, along with the buffs to weapon arts, makes FP, which is effectively your mana, much more useful, and provides a wider variety for builds. Elden Ring was the first time I allocated any of my flasks to FP, instead of solely focusing on HP regen. With these systems, it makes it much more feasible to do cross builds now. I didn't do it in my playthrough, but if I put some more stat points into increasing my max FP, I could very easily add some arcane spells to my build, and they would have actually done damage. The changes to combat are relatively minor compared to the likes of Bloodborne and especially Sekiro, but they change enough for me to bring it up. Earlier, I talked about the open world of this game, and the advantages and disadvantages this brings. But there is one disadvantage I neglected to mention, and it has to do with the bosses. Because of the open world, you are free to tackle challenges in any order you see fit, disregarding a few required bits. This means that you might find some bosses that you're not nearly strong enough to take on yet, and this is fine. I actually really like finding areas and enemies that I know I have to come back for. The real problem starts when you start finding bosses that are absolutely trivialized by your stats alone. One of the main bosses in Elden Ring I just totally stat checked because I did it later than I was supposed to. The fight was visually stunning and mechanically interesting, but a lot of that was lost because of how much easier it was than it should have been. This happened to me numerous times throughout the game, although most of the time it was for more optional bosses. This isn't the only issue present with bosses because of the open world. The other issue I have is memorability. Remember when I talked about Margit and how great it felt to finally beat him? That's the sign of a good boss. And I think most people who play the game will have a similar experience with Margit. But they have a boss with a very visually similar design. Twice. These are both fun and unique boss fights in their own right, and I'm sure it makes sense in the lore, but it makes each one less memorable. That boss fight I was overleveled for? That fight lost a lot of its majesty because of how easy it was. And those quests that I skipped? The same thing with their boss fights. You get the idea. That's not to say that the game doesn't have some great and memorable fights. Margit, Malekith, and Radahn, just to name a few. Game journalists finally cried enough for From Software to add an easy mode. It's just called Sorcery and Spirit Summoning. I'm kidding, by the way. Play the game however you want. But seriously, Spirit Summoning especially makes Elden Ring a lot more accessible. Having an AI companion take aggro from the boss and do damage for you is pretty handy, especially for a new player who doesn't know that fat rolling is really bad. It's just a shame that the hardcore players are going to cry about it and say you didn't play the game if you used it. And in case you're wondering, yes, I did Spirit Summon, although only on 2 of the bosses, and one of those I think was really justified. Fuck. Yes, dude, I don't know why that boss was so hard. That was so stupid. Hate this. That's pretty much all I have to say, and I really don't know how to end videos. So if you skipped Sekiro, go play that one. Okay, bye!